For thousands of years, man envied the flight of the birds. His dream was to fly, and his mythology and folklore has ascribed the secret of flight to the gods he worshipped. But not until 1903 was he to discover the answer to the riddle of flight, when Wilbur and Orville Wright challenged the laws of physics and cautiously spread their man-made wings. Since that day, thousands of aircraft types have been constructed and tested. In this melange of flying machinery, some aircraft became specialized in purpose, and some of them were good, enduring for years of use by the world community. But within this potpourri of good aircraft, an elite developed. Their types can probably be counted by the fingers on two hands. This elite group comprises the great aircraft, built and flown in great numbers, and many are still flying today. This is a great aircraft, the McDonnell Douglas F4. What qualities distinguish this type of aircraft from others? How did its design and its evolution come about? This man is generally credited as the moving force behind the design and development of the F4. His name, Harlan Barkey. Mr. Barkey, how did the design and evolution of the F4 come about?
Late in 1953 and continuing in 1954, Mr. J.S. McDonnell personally and assisted by David Lewis carried numerous aircraft studies to Washington to discuss with the BUAIR and C&O. The final study was constructed in the form of a full-scale mock-up at the McDonnell plant in St. Louis. Finally, in 1954, the BUAIR gave McDonnell a letter of intent to design and build two aircraft similar to the mock-up display. I was the project engineer unofficially at the time, since I was working out of the advanced design department.
Mr. Barkey, then what in your judgment became the distinguishing characteristics of the F4 insofar as mission requirements?
Well, I think that can be simply stated by the mission, which was fleet air defense. That is, the aircraft was to be deployed from a carrier, cruise out to a radius of 250 nautical miles, stay on cap, and attack an intruder when required, and return to the carrier within a total deck cycle time of 3 hours.
Looking at the model of the aircraft that we have on the table here, the configuration of the aircraft is quite a lot different from aircraft that we saw prior to the introduction of the F4. For example, the negative dihedral on the tail. How did this configuration evolve?
Well, as far as the negative dihedral on the tail, what we attempted to do in this configuration was to have the advantage of tail roots above the jet wake and yet be able to get the stabilator tips down to near the level or water line of the wing.
When the Navy laid out the specifications for this aircraft, did they specify that it would be a two-man aircraft?
Not really. For during this period, there were two schools of thought in the Navy as to whether Navy aircraft of this type should be single-place or two-place. So McDonnell prepared both single and two-place configurations. Both versions were shown to the BUAIR and C&O, and within 36 hours, the contractor was advised by the Navy of their selection for the two-place version.
Did it make any difference to us which we built?
Not really. We were, in fact, happy to please the customer.
Were we competing with anybody for this kind of an aircraft?
Until this time, there was no competition. However, as soon as it appeared that the program might go beyond the research and development effort, the BUAIR in 1955 invited Chance Vaught to build a competing aircraft for the same mission. Chance Vaught designed and built prototypes of the F-8U-3, a single-place, single-engine, missile-carrying aircraft. In 1958, the F-4 and the F-8U-3 flew a hard-fought, side-by-side competition during the Navy preliminary evaluation at Edwards Air Force Base. After this competition, the Buair awarded McDonnell a very limited production contract for the F-4 in December 1958. The F-4 was pretty much designed and developed by experienced engineers working with very dedicated Navy officers.
If you had it to do all over again, what would you do different, if anything?
I would say, really, with the circumstances as they were, I mean, the availability of engines and other equipment, missiles and so forth, I probably would do it the same way.
On May 27th, 1958, F-4 number 1 was rolled out and made ready for its first flight. Here is the pilot who made that first flight, Bob Little of McDonnell Douglas Corporation. What thoughts are in the mind of a test pilot as he prepares to make a flight in a new aircraft type?
Well, that was 20 years ago, so it's hard to recall specifically any particular thoughts. Our intention on that flight was to take the airplane supersonic on its first flight. We had done that 4 years before in the F-101, and it was certainly something that could be accomplished in the F-4. It didn't work out that way. The landing gear didn't come all the way up, and on that flight a hydraulic system failed on takeoff, so I had to bring the airplane in after about 20 minutes of learning how to fly it well enough so I could land it. But the thoughts that go through your mind on the first flight are really no different than any other flight. You're in this kind of business. You've been doing it for years, and you've been handling high-performance airplanes. So this is another airplane that you take up and begin a determination of its characteristics and capabilities.
That first flight lasted approximately 20 minutes. When did you realize that the F-4 was a real winner, so to speak, that it was a great airplane?
That was really on the fourth flight. On the fourth flight, we had everything working well, and ran the airplane out at 50,000 feet to almost 1.8 Mach number in level flight, leaving the F-101 chase plane far behind, far below. And it was on that flight that I knew we had a very high-performance airplane.
Mr. Little, from a pilot's point of view, and a scientist actually, what are the distinguishing characteristics of a great aircraft?
Well, unquestionably, in my mind, the first requirement is performance. If you don't have that, you won't even have the opportunity to develop and refine the other characteristics which are necessary, such as handling qualities. It's got to be a safe airplane. Ability to do its mission, just tied in with range and payload capability. The maintainability features of the airplane, so it can fly in service when you want it to fly with minimum work on the ground and minimum expense. Those kind of things have to be in an airplane that becomes ultimately a great airplane.
If you had it to do all over again, is there anything you would do to change the design of the F-4 or the test program?
No, I wouldn't change a thing. After all, we won. It was a major competition, and I guess what we did was right, because we beat a very worthy competitor and ended up with a program that's run for 20 years.
The F-4 started out as a superlative aircraft, a record setter, and has been continually improved from the time it went to sea in 1960 until it broke all existing records for its type. Admiral Frederick Michaelis, Chief of Naval Material and one of the senior naval aviators, describes how the Navy used the F-4.
Well, we had, for the first time in our hands, a long-range interceptor for the defense of the fleet. It was clear that the F-4 was designed to fill a very deficient gap. We had entered a period when attack was high speed against the fleet. We needed standoff. We needed quick responsiveness. We needed a all-weather capability, and that's what we achieved in the F-4. And we had used those advantages to, I think, great degree in achieving a defense of the fleet that we were looking for.
In your role as commander of a carrier task group, what were the various missions of the F-4s under that command?
We, of course, used it to the greatest degree in its design mission. We used it both in combat air patrol for the defense of the fleet and for deck-launched intercept. We had the responsiveness from the airplane that permitted us to, at certain times of our choosing and under conditions in which intelligence permitted us to have a somewhat less relaxed posture than immediate combat, we would be prepared to launch from the deck. So those two were the main uses. Of course, as time went on, as has been the case in previous fighters, when we've had to augment our air-to-ground capability, we got around to that with the F-4 also.
Admiral Michaelis, in day-to-day carrier operations, what are the most significant aspects of a commander of a carrier task group?
Well, I think the duties of the carrier task group are just as varied or as pointed as the task that that group has been assigned to do. Certainly, whether it's a matter of controlling sea lanes and therefore making certain that we're carrying out our national requirements to keep those sea lanes clear than necessary, or whether we're extending our strikes across the land-sea interface, the problem is always one of getting the job done, utilizing your aircraft and your ships to the greatest advantage. That means that a great deal of time of the task group commander is spent in the business of targeting, coordinating of defenses and offense. Certainly the primary job is to carry out the offensive task and at the same time to conserve our resources both in terms of equipment and men to the greatest degree possible.
Admiral Michaelis, if you had been a member of the design team of the F-4, would you have made any changes to the design?
I remember those days, and I have to think back on the days when we were trying to acquire the F-4, and under those conditions I would say no. We went after a long-range interceptor, and we got one. We went after one that had an all-weather capability, and we got one. We employed two people. That's one of the first times in a fighter that we'd ever employed two people. And we found great advantage there as we moved into the difficulties and the complexities of all-weather intercept. I would say no, I wouldn't make very many changes to it.
Although built for the Navy, the distinguishing performance features of the F-4 soon attracted the attention of the United States Air Force. And in 1962, a number of trials and competitive exercises proved the F-4 to be the superlative legend its designers had envisioned. General William W. Momayer, former commander of the Tactical Air Command, tells of qualities of the F-4 performance in the United States Air Force.
Well, I think there are a number of qualities that you could look at. Traditionally, one would look at the performance, whether it's high or low performance, whether it has capability of being maintained with a relatively high state of readiness, the ease with which you can transition pilots into it, the ability to deploy it and support it from relatively undeveloped conditions. But I come back, basically, it seems to me, the qualities that I think set one airplane apart from another. in a fighter inventory. And that's the flexibility. And by flexibility, I mean the variety of missions that can be performed with it. And they can perform those missions to an acceptable degree that the combat commander can use that aircraft in these variety of conditions that are relatively unpredictable. And I say, if there's one thing about war that's predictable, it's unpredictability. And the use of an aircraft for counter-air, air superiority, interdiction, reconnaissance, defense suppression, all of these qualities of flexibility, in my judgment, is what makes a fighter outstanding.
In your judgment, why has the F-4 endured and enjoyed such a long production run, where others perhaps have not experienced this same durability? Is it this flexibility that you're talking about?
Yes. I think the F-4 was way ahead of its time in terms of high speed. It was a Mach 2 plus aircraft to begin with. It started out as a Navy interceptor, and due to the flexibility that within the design, with the modifications that were made for the Air Force, we were able to turn it into a fighter bomber. And then later on, we made a reconnaissance version of it. And then even later, we used it in a wild weasel role in Vietnam War, that is the suppression of SAMs, which it is still a part of the Air Force today, the F-4G. So it had this variety of capabilities, and this is what you look for in an aircraft, that you can use it in these variety of roles. So the F-4 started out as an interceptor, it ends up as a reconnaissance, a fighter bomber, an air superiority fighter, an interdiction aircraft, and a wild weasel. These are really outstanding qualities in any single aircraft.
But in retrospect, if you had been on the original design team that laid out the mission requirements or the design requirements of the F-4, would you have made any changes?
No, I think basically I can't see any changes that I would have made in terms of its high speed, in terms of its load carrying capabilities, in terms of its deployment.
In 1965, McDonnell Douglas produced F-4 number 1000, and after routine tests, delivered the aircraft to the United States Navy. Later, on March 12, 1967, F-4 number 2000 was produced, flown, and delivered to the United States Air Force. And on September 5, 1968, another milestone was reached, with F-4 number 3000. And after testing, it too was delivered to the Navy. In the late 60s, the F-4 was chosen to be the official flight demonstration aircraft to be used by both the U.S. Navy Blue Angels and the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds. Then, the first line defender of the free world was dressed in tuxedos and demonstrated its grace. On February 1st, 1971, the 4000th F-4 was rolled out, pre-flighted, and after a brief ceremony was flown. After qualification testing, the aircraft was delivered to the United States Air Force. In a parallel sequence of historical events, the Department of Defense had authorized the sale of the F-4 to selected nations of the free world. The F-4 has been delivered to 10 nations of the international community, thereby becoming a worldwide standard against which other aircraft are measured. 24th, 1978 in St. Louis, Missouri. This is the commemoration ceremony for F-4 number 5000, a celebration of 20 years of service to the free world by the F-4. McDonnell Aircraft Company President George Graff opened the program.
Today, 20 years after the first Phantom lifted from that runway out there, we are delivering the 5,000th F-4 built in this and in nearby buildings. Many of you here today worked on that first Phantom. Many of our subcontractors represented here today have been on the F-4 program from its inception. All of you have contributed greatly to this most successful program, and we take this opportunity to thank you. A number of people, most of them are competitors, slur the Phantom. They say it's ugly. Some even contend it lacks aerodynamic efficiency. Now, I'd be the first to admit that the F-4 might not win a beauty contest, but we didn't design it for beauty contests. It was designed to fight and win, and it does both. The F-4 Phantom never was withdrawn from combat because the going got tough, as were some of its more pulchritudinous paper tiger contemporaries. Yes, we're proud of the Phantom. On these premises and within the aerospace industry, there are at least two McDonnell Douglas figures who quite literally require no introduction. Both are here today. Ladies and gentlemen, a talented and widely respected engineer and businessman, the President and Chief Executive Officer of McDonnell Douglas Corporation, Sandy McDonnell.
Thank you, George. You know, I can assure you that the parents of the Phantom here at McDonnell Douglas, and they number in the thousands, consider it to be one beautiful airplane. And the pilots who have flown this airplane and their two generations, and they number in the tens of thousands, consider it to be one sweetheart of a fighter. We're very proud of the airplane and the way it looks. But the Phantom's beauty is more than just skin deep. The Phantom has brought benefits to its creators, to the St. Louis community in which it's assembled, and to hundreds of other communities throughout the United States where its subcontractors and other suppliers have made parts for it. Many others here in this St. Louis vicinity owe to the F-4 Phantom their jobs on the F-15 Eagle and the F-18 Hornet. And other McDonnell Douglas personnel working on such diversified fields as computers, healthcare products, electronics, they also owe a debt of gratitude to the Phantom. But the Phantom has made contributions on a broader scene. Approximately over 1,000 Phantoms have been sold abroad to various foreign allies by the U.S. government. And in the process, this has brought to the United States a positive gold flow of almost $6 billion. Now that's quite a list of accomplishment for one airplane, and the Phantom is a beautiful bird, as you will see in a few minutes when we unveil the 5,000th airplane. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you James S. McDonnell, known to his teammates as Mr. Mach.
It's a real pleasure to help celebrate the 20th birthday of this ugly duckling, this Phantom. How did this airplane get started in the first place? Lo and behold, it came to pass in the year 1954 AD that our little company was hungry. Looking down the road, we didn't see how we could keep all of our teammates employed. The government at that time had no requirement for a new fighter plane and no requirement for a new attack airplane. So on our own initiative, we went into creative labor and we conceived a new design that served two purposes, both fighter and attack. It had two engines for great power and to bring the boys home in peace and war. It had a crew of two on account of the multiple roles and missions. It had a dozen alternate nose ends on account of the multiple roles and missions. Now, we took this hybrid design, hopefully, to Washington, D.C. in late 1954. The result, no sale. The fighter desk didn't want it because it was too big. The attack and bomber desk didn't want it because it was too small. It was now not only a hybrid, it was also an orphan. How in the world we ever finally sold it, even old Mach doesn't really know. But in 1955, we did get a contract. Maybe somebody in the government felt our little company might somehow be an asset to America someday, and so should not be allowed to go broke. The first contract was with the attack desk in the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics, as the Admiral mentioned. The Phantom was therefore designated the AH-1. A stood for attack, and H stood for McDonnell, or the hell of it, I don't know which. And then the -1, the first of its type. And we sometimes jokingly referred to it, the AH-1, as the A-1. Now, after several months, however, the attack desk had a change of commanders, and the new commander decided against the A-1. We barely avoided contract termination by getting it transferred to the fighter desk, I guess by the grace of God. And there the AH-1 was redesignated the F-4H-1. And there this early orphan, this hybrid, this ugly duckling, this F-4H fabulous Phantom has had a happy home for the past 22 years. And in behalf of all of the McDonnell Douglas Corporation, I want to express deep appreciation to all of the personnel of our company and to the personnel of the Navy and the personnel of the Air Force who have worked on and in this fabulous Phantom for the past 22 years. It took all of these people working together to make the fabulous team that created the fabulous Phantom. And I thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Mack. And now I'd like to ask Harlan Barkey, who is Mr. Phantom, if he'd come down here to the podium and press the button which will unveil the Phantom.
This is a great aircraft, the McDonnell Douglas F4, fully mature in its conception and development, yet as agile, graceful, and youthful as the day it was born. A lance held poised in defense of the free world, a standard of excellence, performance, and proven capability, worthy of imitation for years to come. The fabulous Phantom, 5,000 and still counting.